Hi, you guys. Welcome back to part two of chapter 22. We left off talking about Pearl Harbor, which occurred December 7th, 1941. It was the Japanese bombing of this U.S. naval base that will draw America into World War II. So after Pearl Harbor, FDR will go to Congress and you'll ask Congress for a declaration of war against Japan. Now, the very next day, Germany will declare war on the United States. So now we are fully in World War II. So let's turn to the war in the Pacific, okay? We'll also talk about the war in Europe, but let's turn to the war in the Pacific for just a moment. So, what's going on with Japan during this time? By the time we get to the 1940s, Japan has occupied portions of French Indochina, which included Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia. And in 1941, Japan will also conquer Burma, which is now known as Myanmar, and Siam, which is now known as Thailand. Japan will also take control of the Dutch East Indies. Now, why would they want control of the Dutch East Indies? Well, the Dutch East Indies was very oil rich, so they take control of it for their oil. They will also occupy Guam and the Philippines. They will force about 78,000 American and Filipino troops to surrender. Also, in the war in the Pacific, German submarines will sink hundreds of Allied merchant and naval vessels during the Battle of the Atlantic. So we have lots of German submarine warfare going on right now. In the May 1942, we have the Battle of the Coral Sea. During the Battle of the Coral Sea, the American Navy is able to turn back a Japanese fleet that was really intent on invading Australia. So that is a good Allied victory. The Battle of the Coral Sea, which occurred in May 1942, is an Allied victory where American naval forces are able to turn back a Japanese fleet that was pretty intent on attacking Australia. Now, these victories, such as the Battle of the Coral Sea, allow American forces to drive the Japanese from fortified islands and also bring American troops a little closer to Japan. Now, in Europe, on the other hand, in May 1942, British and American forces will invade North Africa. And in May 1943, they will force the surrender of the German army that's there. Now, by the spring of 1943, in the Atlantic, the Allied forces, are the Big Four, remember, are really at this point able to gain the upper hand in the Atlantic. British and American destroyers and planes will devastate the German submarine fleet, and so that's incredibly helpful. And in July 1943, Italy is liberated by Italian and British forces. So by 1943, we have a good amount of Allied victories that really slow down the war in Europe. June 6th, 1944 is known as D-Day. D-Day is when 200,000 American, British, and Canadian soldiers under the command of General Dwight D. Eisenhower, they land in Normandy in an effort to liberate Paris, which for the past, I'll say 4 years at this point, had been occupied by Nazi Germany. And so Paris ends up being liberated after about 2 months of fighting in August 1944 after D-Day. Now let's go back a couple of years to August 1942. In August 1942, German soldiers will launch a siege at Stalingrad, which is in the Soviet Union at this time. So, Stalingrad ends up being a pretty, I'm not going to call it a comprehensive loss for the Germans, but it is a huge loss for Germany at this time. During the German siege at Stalingrad, about 800,000 Germans will die. About 1.2 million Russians will die. So the death toll is enormous And this is just during the siege at Stalingrad. So German forces are forced to surrender. And the German surrender at Stalingrad in January 1943 really marked a turning point in the European war. So by the time we get to 1943, you have some pretty decisive Allied victories that will kind of mark the beginning of the end of the war in Europe. Now, in 1941, leading up to 1941, I wish I had more time to talk about the Holocaust in this class, but leading up to 1941, we have Jewish individuals who we really see a lot of, if you recall, de jure segregation, which is segregation by law, as well as de facto segregation, which is segregation by habit or by custom. And so we start to see Jewish people who cannot own businesses anymore. They are forced from their homes, and many are forced to move into these ghettos, which were really just housing until they moved them to concentration camps. In 1941, Hitler begins the final or his final solution, which was the mass extermination of anyone that he saw as being undesirable. So Slavs, gypsies, if you were gay, of course, Jewish, anyone handicapped, anyone who is seen as undesirable will go to work camps, or I will call them, no, death camps. I might make a video after this that talks about, or I might just put it in part three, how does Germany pick up the pieces after these death camps, after these concentration camps are liberated? Do they have to come face to face with that? And so I will address that in part three, I promise, if I remember. Okay, but continuing. So this is what's going on in Europe. But what's going on in the United States? How does the US prepare for war? What do we do to ensure that we have supplies for the war? So we'll turn to mobilizing the war, or mobilizing for war with the home front. So World War II transformed the role of the national government. We have the creation of so many different, I would say, facets of national government. We have the creation of the War Production Board, as well as the War Manpower Commission and the Office of Price Administration. The government will really mobilize for this war. So they will build housing for war workers. They will force civilian industries to retool for war production. So if you worked at a plant that made cars, well, now your plant may make tanks instead. So you see a lot of civilian industries that will come under government control, and they will retool for war production. By 1944, our production is so rapid that American factories will produce a ship every day and a plane every 5 minutes. So we really ramp up for war. During World War II, the gross national product will rise from about $91 billion to $214 billion. So during World War II, again, our gross national product will go from about 91 billion to 214 billion dollars during the war. And FDR would offer incentives to businesses to spur war production. So incentives could include low interest loans, for example, tax concessions or tax cuts, right? Or contracts. You could get a contract with the government that would have a guaranteed profit. So federal funds definitely reinvigorated established manufacturing areas, and it also created new industrial centers. So prior to World War II, we really didn't talk about the West Coast that much. Well, now, because of war production on the West Coast, it will create a new industrial center, especially around like the Bay Area. And because of that, you'll have a lot of migrants who will go to these areas for the job. So the West Coast will become a new industrial center because of the war, and there will be housing that's built in that area, factories that are built in that area as well. Now, World War II is known as the Good War because remember how the war is being described. It's not, we're not fighting, you know, we are fighting an enemy, but we're fighting for the four freedoms. And this is where we get the four freedoms. This is where it comes back in. Remember, the four freedoms are introduced in 1941. And to Roosevelt, these four freedoms really express deeply held American values that are worthy of being spread worldwide. So, even though on the Norman Rockwell portrait, and you have this in your slide presentation on the second slide, you see the freedom from want, freedom from fear, freedom of speech, and freedom of religion, essentially, freedom to worship, as it's called. The initial reason or initial definition of freedom from want didn't have really anything to do with hunger and people needing things to survive, but it's more tangible in that way. Freedom from want, the initial meaning really was for really the elimination of barriers to international trade. However, it transformed to protecting the future standard of living of the American worker and farmer because it's something that's much more tangible. Remember, we're just getting out of the Great Depression where there was a great deal of want. There was a great deal of hunger. There was a great deal of needs not being met. And so, freedom from want, that initial meaning of eliminating barriers to international trade, will transform to mean that the future standard of living of the farmer and the worker need to be protected by guaranteeing that this Great Depression wouldn't just resume after the war. And so that's something that's really important. Now, during World War I, we had the creation of the Committee on Public Information, and that was to explain the war to Americans. Similarly, during World War II, we have another government office that will be created, but this one is called the Office of War Information, or the OWI. The OWI was created in 1942 to mobilize public opinion around the war. And so, what's so interesting about this is that they will utilize really every medium that is available to speak to the American public. The OWI will use radio, film, which is pretty big at this time, the press, and any other media they can to really give the conflict an ideological meaning. You're not just fighting bad guys, you are fighting for the four freedoms. You're fighting for this way of life. You're fighting for this theory, really gives it an ideological meaning. The OWI also wanted to avoid a lot of the nationalist hysteria that occurred with the World War. Now, another thing that will change or that will be different between I would say, propaganda that's available in World War I versus World War II is that you will see way more women. In a lot of these posters. Women specifically will be marketed to during World War II. During the war, the nation will mobilize women to fill these vacant industrial jobs. Where are the men? The men are fighting the war. And so now women are being invited into these industrial jobs to work because it's absolutely necessary. Now, here is a caveat, and it's something that's very important for you to note. The mobilization of women as workers is not Okay, I repeat, it is not an expansion of women's rights or women's freedom, because in all of the propaganda posters, from Rosie the Riveter to any other woman working in a war industry, all of these jobs are being depicted as temporary. It's not join, join this industry and make a living. It's help your nation so we can win. So I'll give you an example of some of these posters and why it's really depicted, or why you can see it being depicted as temporary. So the first poster that I have on this slide, and for those of you who are following along, it is slide number 20. It says, the more women at work, the sooner we win. Okay, the more women at work, the sooner we win. It has nothing to do about women's freedom, women's pay in the workplace, and expansion of women's rights or freedoms. It's you are working here so we can win the war. Okay. So, the Office of War Information, their publications will encourage women to work, but again, the work is temporary. But by 1944, women will constitute more than one third of the civilian labor force. So, a lot of this propaganda that will be shown to women, or will be not necessarily shown, but will be really propagated, I'll say, to women, it depicts this work as being temporary, but it also depicts them as filling a very necessary place in the workplace. So Rosie the Riveter, which is the woman that we often see with the red bandana, and she's standing there like this, that her job was to rivet. It was to rivet bolts into probably like an airplane or a tank. But what they don't tell you is that more than likely after the war, Rosie probably went back to either her professional job as maybe a typist or a secretary, or she went back home. So it wasn't really a it's not a rallying call for women to work by any means. It's just women need to fill these jobs that have been left vacant by men. Okay, so that is the end of part two. I will come back with part three, uh, where we'll be talking about the National Resources Planning Board. See you in a bit.